Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to this final session of Day 2 of the IRENA Innovation Week. This afternoon, we're focusing on the geopolitics of the energy transition, especially innovation in critical materials. And this session is being held in partnership with the Energy Transitions Commission. So the point about this particular session is really to bring together policymakers, industry experts, and leaders to discuss the potential impact of innovation on the availability and demand for critical materials. So this panel discussion is going to be moderated by Elizabeth Press, who many of you will remember from yesterday, or indeed know. For those who don't, she's the Director of Planning and Programme Support at IRENA. Now, she's going to do a quick presentation, and then we will bring the panel onto the stage. And of course, as ever, during the panel discussion, do feel free to ask questions through Slido.
All right, thank you, Felicia. Thank you, and wonderful to see you, everybody back here. Before I invite the panel up to the stage, oh, this is really uncomfortable, the lights. I wanted to first ask a question and then give you a few headlines from the report that we just released on the geopolitics of critical materials. So we're starting with a slide. I hope you guys have it. There's a lot of talk about this bucket of critical materials that we're going to run out of, and we're going to have big problems with energy transition. So I wondered whether you would have an idea which one is the most critical in the bucket of criticality. So I'll give you like 10 seconds to work on this before I show you IRENA's scarcity ratio that looked at key materials and tried to estimate which ones are really likely to be complicated in the short term. All right. Oh, I'm loving this. Wrong. All right, I think we stabilized. Can I have the next slide? Also, I just saw somebody doing platinum. Platinum is probably one of the least complicated one. So you can see that dysprosium, I think that's how it's pronounced, is out of the list that we gave you, one that is highly likely to face market tightness in the coming years. So what we did here, we basically looked at several forecasts and estimates what is going to happen between now and 2030. And I think what's really interesting of us discussing this today is that there's so many uncertainties, including around innovation, that really make it difficult to estimate what is going to happen in the next decade or so. One thing is for sure, there are a few materials that will struggle because we do not have enough supply today. So what we looked here is what is the current supply and what are the projections and what are the estimates of potential scarcity ratio. And this is what we have seen in the looking at the current situation. Oh, I can change it. The other issue that is, in addition to scarcity, is a geographical concentration, and I think this is what is probably the most known about critical materials right now, is how limited the supply is and how scarce. How concentrated it is. So we looked at, for some materials, where they are currently mined and refined, and then looked what might happen in 2030. And the conclusion is that not much will change because the developing mining and refining capabilities is actually a lengthy process. And it can go from 5 to 15, 16 years. So in the coming years, we will probably see the expansion of what exists and some new areas emerging, but largely staying consistent in terms of concentration. That also shows how important it is for countries to collaborate and be alert to understand where the potential bottlenecks can come from. But this is where innovation becomes incredibly important. So what was observed since 2015 in the battery mix, chemistry mix, is really astounding. When you look at what the composition was for majority of, what is the share of different chemical mixes in batteries in 2015 and 7 years later is really, really interesting. It shows that disruptive innovation will have a lot of impact on how the demand for materials will evolve in the coming years. And this is where we will be talking, we'll be spending a lot of time talking about today. The first area is like, how do we deal with physical constraints that we have today, both in terms of where the diversification will come from, how will that influence the dynamics, geopolitical dynamics in the coming decade, the disruptive innovation, what are we observing, where the change is happening, and how do we round it up with the recycling, reuse, and end-of-life economy that will eventually come in the next couple of decades. So with that scene set up, I would like to invite my fellow panelists to the stage, and I will just, I don't have my glasses, so we're going to have to look back on the screen. So Leonardo Buizza, who is a clean energy supply chain's lead analyst from Energy Transition Commission. Leonardo has been a great partner in working with us on this report, and they simultaneously released another report, and I'll speak to him about that as well. Lucilla Crexell, who is a national senator from Argentina. Lucilla, please come to the stage. Lovely to have you with us. Sjarah Soede, Deputy Director, Inclusive Green Growth Department of the Netherlands, Foreign Office of the Netherlands. And Indra Øverland, also close collaborator from the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. We have a long-standing collaboration on many issues, including on materials for the report that we have just done. So, thank you everybody, and wonderful to have you here, and thank you for accepted to speak to us today. And let me start with Leonardo. Leonardo, you just did your own analysis as well. We had many discussions in the process of development. Can you reflect a little bit what are the key findings that you see that are relevant for our conversation today?
Yeah, thank you, Elizabeth, and it's a pleasure to be with you all here, with everyone. It was great to see IRENA come out with their report back in July on the geopolitics of critical minerals. And it was so satisfying not just to be involved in reviewing and in the process of developing that report, but also to see it sing from the same hymn sheet and be in such symphony with the report that we published as the Energy Transitions Commission. And really, we had two goals when we published that report. The first part of the report was setting out really clearly some of the challenges, but also some of the myths around the sustainability of this transition towards a materials-intensive clean energy system. And then the second half of the report was really more focused on where do the key challenges lie and what are the potential solutions. So in just a couple of minutes, I'll try and set this out clearly. On the myth-busting side of things, I think there's really four things that we need to keep in mind as we step back and think about this big picture transition. The first is, obviously, we have enough materials out there. Geological resources are well in excess of future demand from now all the way to 2050 and beyond across all of these different critical energy transition materials, whether it's lithium, copper, neodymium, or the rest. There is a challenge in scaling economic reserves, but the resources out there are more than plentiful. So we shouldn't buy into the myth that there's not enough lithium out there for all of your electric vehicle batteries. The second myth was around the emissions associated with building all these materials. We did some numbers on this. We found that between now and 2050, the production of all these different energy transition materials, including steel, concrete, aluminium, all these energy-intensive materials, would be maybe 15 to 35 billion tons of CO2. That compares with over 40 billion tons of CO2 equivalent currently emitted by the fossil fuel-based energy system every single year. This shift from a fossil fuel-based energy system to a clean energy system is going to be a shift to a lower emissions, inherently more sustainable energy system. Third final myth that we wanted to bust was just the scale of materials required. Again, if you look from now to 2050, all of those wind turbines, solar panels, electric vehicle batteries, and the rest, and added up all of the materials needed, that would be maybe 6,500 million tons of materials, most of which is steel, aluminium, and copper. The amounts of lithium, neodymium, rare earth elements, and the rest are trivial in comparison to these big industrial materials. And that compares to 8,000 million tons of coal that we extract every single year. So again, we're not talking about sums of materials that are inaccessible, infeasible, that we don't know how to manage and handle. So let's set those myths to one side and focus really on the key challenges. And here, we're in perfect harmony with what you just set out. There's three big challenges. The first is scaling up supply quickly across a wide range of different materials, copper, lithium, and the rest. Maybe 250, 300 more mines or mined output equivalent might be needed between now and the next decade. And that needs addressing in terms of mining timescales, making them faster, and also scaling investments in extracting all of these different materials. We're going to need more mining in the next decade. We should make sure that the capital flows in order to achieve that. The second big challenge, as you highlighted, is de-risking and diversifying supply, which is currently very concentrated, both at the mining stage, but also at the refining stage. And then thirdly, a big point that we wanted to touch on, even though this shift from a clean energy to a clean energy system is going to be inherently more sustainable, there's a wide range of local environmental and social challenges that do need to be addressed for two reasons. One, because we want to make clean energy technologies and their supply chains as sustainable as possible. But two, to make sure that we really bring the whole of society, but also these local communities where the mining takes place, along with us in the wider energy transition. We have to make sure that trust and consent is a key part of that process. And so those are the three big challenges that we completely agree with you on, need to be addressed by ongoing national critical mineral strategies, industrial policy, and the rest, in order to scale up clean energy supply chains quickly and sustainably.
Yeah, thank you, Leonardo. And let me now turn to Lucilla, because we mentioned lithium quite a few times because it's one that stays in everybody's minds. It's the most visible one. And obviously there's Argentina, Bolivia, Chile triangle, and the big potential. Right now you're 50% of a global supply, and the reserves are there. So can you talk to us about both the national strategy but also the regional strategy on lithium?
The good news is that we don't have to worry about lithium supply.
There we go.
Well, Argentina is part of, it's located in what we call Triángulo del Lithium Triangle. And it's one of the main resources of lithium in the world. And it's the difference with the critical materials, probably that we have with fuel, is that they are geographically concentrated. And as you said, the triangle has 56% of the reserves of the world. But, the resources, but has the 52% of the reserves. Let's say that those are measurable and they are accessible with the available technology. But when we have to analyze the performance of the countries, we can see an important imbalance, because Chile is producing the 41% of the lithium and Argentina only the 10%, and Bolivia is not playing a role right now in the production of lithium. Other countries in America Latina, we have the 60% of the resources, and we have the three types of resources. We have brains, pegmatites, and also sedimentary rocks. But the triangle is mostly, but it's bright reserves, which has probably some pros and some cons also, because I'm not an expert in this matter, but it's probably easier to extract the material, but it has lots of environmental risks. So we have to be worried with the techniques and the innovation that we need in order to get the lithium without polluting the environment. So let me return to this. So we have resources, reserves, but we also have an important concentration in the world production of lithium. Today, the 96% of the production is explained by Australia, Chile, China, and Argentina. And if we go to refining, then we can see that China takes around the 70% of the lithium refining. So we don't have to be worried about the supply of lithium, but probably we can ask if we need to diversify the production and also the refining of the lithium.
Yeah, thank you for that. And in our report, we actually looked at electric mobility value chain and what is the difference when you go up the value chain and how much value you can capture locally, and not to talk about other benefits like emissions from shipping and other benefits that come with localization of this processing. I think it's very interesting, and we'll come back to you on this, but I want to go to Sjarah now because I think both Leonardo and Lucilla mentioned, first of all, we need to mine more, but how we do it, that's a little bit of a question because it's obvious that we cannot do it the way it was done in the past. And your department deals with these things, so can you reflect a little bit on this aspect?
Yes, thank you very much, Elizabeth. And I think the previous speakers have already alluded to it, that it's important to do responsible and sustainable sourcing of minerals, and not only look at the security of supply. And why is it important that we do this? We think it's the right thing to do, and it will bring us closer to achieving the shared climate and development goals. And I think there is a widespread recognition now that we should aim for a just and inclusive transition. And businesses and governments can contribute to address potential adverse impact. And so it's the right thing to do, but it will also lead to more local economic development. There is a high potential in bringing more economic development, lifting people out of poverty, if it's managed in the right way. And when we talk about local development, I think what we've also recognized is that we would like to see also countries, I think you alluded to it as well, that you're not only involved developing an emerging economies, not only in extraction, but also in processing and refining capacities, and help countries, assist countries in moving up the value chain. And maybe thirdly, why we should focus on this is, I think that we risk a slowing down of the energy transition if we don't pay attention to these issues. For example, if a mine is being opened and if there's a huge local opposition to it, it will slow down the process. So it's extremely important to include communities in this process. And there are, of course, these environmental risks that need to be addressed, like climate and water. So I think there are plenty of reasons to do things differently, and maybe than some have done in the past. Let's put it that way, I think. Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting. We were just in Kenya for the African Climate Summit, and they don't call them critical materials; they call them strategic materials, because that's it's a strategy that they see for actually development and participation in global economy of the 21st century, rather than criticality. And Indra, we worked together on bits of this as well, and Indra's team kindly collaborated with us, and with this review of lists of critical materials, we discovered 35 of them. And but your bread and butter is geopolitics. Do you see this rush for critical materials to be an incentive for greater collaboration, or how do you see this evolving in the coming years?
Well, most of what we hear about this focuses on the potential for competition and even conflict, and for bottlenecks and all kinds of negative issues. but I think that the potential for cooperation is correspondingly big. Any point here where there's a potential maybe for conflict or competition, there is a corresponding potential to avoid that by cooperating. And I think a reason why people focus on conflict is a kind of I'm going to put it a bit sharply, I could say the intellectual laziness, in that it's very convenient to take an old storyline from the fossil fuels era and transpose it onto a world running on renewable energy. It's easy for the person telling the story because they don't have to change the way they think and the things they know, and it's easy for the audience because people like stories they can recognize. But in fact, when you transition from fossil fuels to clean energy, you throw a lot of things up in the air and they're going to come down differently. Some things may be similar, and there may be some geopolitical conflicts over extraction of some or access to some materials, but a lot of things are going to be different, and there are big opportunities here for establishing new and much more diverse relationships.
Let me go back to Lucilla, actually, because just building of what Indra said, you have a relationship with EU now. You have forged an MOU with the EU. So can you tell us how you see that relationship evolving, and is this going to change the nature of your exchange with the EU in the future?
Well, actually, it shows the potential of the region and the potential of Argentina as a supplier of critical materials, not only lithium, but the list that comes with the agreement. I think it's a window, enormous window to the region, and to do the things different from what we did with the oil and gas industry. I belong to an oil and gas province, and there's a lot of things that we have learned, and I think this agreement, cooperation agreement, provide us or give us a chance to have transfer of knowledge, technology, markets. Argentina now has a very extremely regulated market. So sometimes it's difficult to come to invest in Argentina, and macroeconomics, it's not doing really well, so it's also sometimes difficult for investors to come. So I think these kind of agreements can open lots of, opportunities, not only for Argentina, but for the region. And there's another thing that I think it's really important. It's the governance of the resources and the governance of the lithium in this case, because the three countries that are involved in this brine, which is the Triángulo del Litio, have different models of governance. So we need to cooperate between the countries, between the region, in order to give rules that do the region attractive to invest. So I think it's a very positive. It's a real opportunity to develop the resource and the economy.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I'm going to go to Sjarah now. So I want us to talk a little bit about innovation as well at all levels, not just the technology innovation, but also, you're talking about the governance models and other things, how we do things differently. But Sjarah, to go back to you, we often have this a chapter on human issues, around the gender, water, food, and it's always an add-on. But how do we bring this really into the central discussion around these issues? Because we know the legacy of mining, the legacy of local communities suffering, the legacy of exclusion and lack of benefits. How do we change? What are the practical steps that you see we can actually introduce?
Yeah, I think they should be made an integral part of policy making, of decision making, and that requires multi-stakeholder partnerships, I think. And what we've seen now is often businesses operating in silos, and also seeing that some businesses, especially maybe from our own countries, but are hesitant to invest in the sector because of the perceived risks. And I think we have to look frankly at those risks and how to remove them, and not shy away from confronting them, but then in a different manner. And we do have to do things differently and take these things into account. Otherwise, we will have a green transition, but at what cost? Because then there would still be significant human and environmental costs involved. But maybe not that visible, maybe for the people who own that electric vehicle. Yeah.
Absolutely, and what Lucilla was saying as well, understanding how we can use these bilateral, multilateral agreements to really use them as a vehicle to force change, because it's not going to come on its own. No. And we already see it with some of the pressures to, like, how do you compromise between speed and doing things differently. But we spent a lot of time talking about the supply side and how we can diversify, increase, or whatever, but there is a very important part of disruptive innovation that brings a level of uncertainty to what we're talking about, and the end-of-life recycling reuse element, which should be thought about from now. Leonardo, can you reflect a little bit on what do you see as kind of key innovations, and what do you think will disrupt us in the coming years?
Yeah, I think this is one aspect that sometimes gets missed out, but is really, truly exciting. And we already discussed it a fair bit in the session just before on battery materials, so I hope I don't repeat too much. But I think you already highlighted in your presentation how innovation in the battery space has already, in the last few years, caused significant shifts. So a shift away from cobalt-rich batteries, cobalt-rich NMC batteries, nickel, manganese, cobalt, to cobalt-light or sometimes cobalt-free batteries, such as LFP, lithium iron phosphate. Those kinds of trends and other trends of innovation in the battery space, I think, are really exciting and have the potential to really disrupt future demand. Say, on the anode side of things, increased doping with silicon to reduce graphite demand, or other innovative approaches. But there's also potential for innovation across other sectors and technologies in the energy transition. I loved the stat this morning from Francisco that a 1% improvement in the efficiency of electrolyzers by 2050 translates to 120 gigawatts less of renewables that we need to build. So continuously pushing these sometimes small, sometimes incremental, year-on-year efficiency improvements, over 5, 10, 20 years, really has a significant impact further down the line in terms of reducing energy requirements, reducing material requirements, and wider resource use. So a huge amount of potential for innovation on the demand side. And then obviously, we need to start planning now for a system by the mid-2030s that is ready to take many of the materials that are reaching end of life, whether in batteries and electric vehicles or solar panels at the end of life, and is ready to accept them, recycle them, and turn them into useful second life or second use materials. And so again, we need to get the infrastructure, the logistics, and the investments on that recycling supply chain ready in the next decade, so that we're ready by the 2030s and onwards for this more circular system.
Yeah, we were running Slido behind your back. I was going to do it after you finish, but the question was really like, what is the driver? What is the driver of change and the deployment? So whether it's innovation, whether it's pressures, whether it's both, whether it's neither. Yeah. Indra, you wanted to come.
I wanted to pick up on what you were saying, and I think you said a key word, Elizabeth, in your question, Tim, which is uncertainty, and I think that's going to become more and more a key issue, is that there is so much uncertainty, in large part due to positive developments. But the key to understanding this is that there are so many technologies involved compared to the fossil fuel era, where there are also many and some quite complex technologies involved. But still, it's much, much more now, and it opens so many possibilities. So you can't predict where there's going to be innovation, but you can predict that there will be very many innovations, sometimes incremental, sometimes more dramatic. And I mean, you mentioned before, you have not only technological innovation, but also in terms of governance and markets and so on. But if we just look at the technological area, and what we were discussing now, for example, batteries, which is replacement of one technology with another, you also could have innovations in terms of exploration, in terms of extraction, in terms of transportation, in terms of processing, very many different, in terms of recycling, in terms of using materials more efficiently or replacing them, substitution within technologies, or in terms of substituting the whole technologies, and there are very many different ones. So uncertainty is going to be a big issue, and it can actually be a big problem because it can discourage companies and governments from investing in things that look promising, but they also look out of the corner of their eye, they see a lot of other stuff going on, and you just don't know which one is going to happen. And I think trying to facilitate continued research and investment and innovation is going to be one of the main challenges.
Yeah, I mean, this is why I included this question here, because it was really interesting. I mean, we have this case study in the report, you know, why did the lithium iron phosphide battery advance so quickly? And part of it was there was a shortage of nickel and cobalt. China bought patents for this particular battery and committed to a certain percentage, it was 40% deployment. And that's what happened. And that's how it actually advanced very quickly. So it was a combination of the two. And I think we're going to see more and more of that. And Indra, if I can just stay with you, because I know, because obviously with the current situation, with the war in Ukraine and Russia, I mean, there is a shortage of materials in that, and this is your area of expertise. So how do you see this evolving? Is the long-term outlook in this space?
Yeah, so Ukraine to some extent, Russia to a much greater extent, has some of the world's biggest mineral resources and potential for finding more in terms of space, because they have a lot of space to find them. But I think actually the main impact of this war is going to be in the fossil fuel sector and is indirectly going to affect critical materials for renewable energy because the reduced access to Russian oil and gas and coal makes them more expensive and makes renewable energy, gives it a competitive advantage, relatively speaking. And I'm not only talking about the direct sanctions, I'm also talking about the loss in Russia, for Russia of investment and of access to Western technology, which has been very, very important for the development of the oil and gas sector in Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union. International oil companies have played a big role. So even if sanctions are not necessarily so effective and so on, there is a big reduction in the cooperation there, and that has a long-term impact on the development of oil and gas fields, which can take 5, 10, 20 years to develop. And that's going to give benefits to renewable energy, which is going to lead to more of this demand for critical materials. And we already see it. I mean, anybody who installed a solar panel or a wind turbine in Europe in the last 10 years has been reducing their payback time and benefiting from that since February last year.
It's interesting. You should point that out because for IRENA in the last strategic cycle, the countries asked us to actually look at renewables-based energy security. And in the past, oftentimes it was about all variable renewables. There is a risk there, but now it's actually recognizing how important it is for energy security of nations. It's very interesting how the narrative is changing because of this situation. Lucilla, going back to you, you also come from oil and gas area, so I think you have a lot of. How do you see the experiences that what you're looking at now with the lithium, and looking to expand and become a global player, a more visible global player in this? What can you say to other mineral-rich countries who are looking at similar things? Not necessarily to compete with you in lithium, but there are other materials.
No, I mean. What we have learned from the oil and gas industry is when we have the decline of conventional oil and gas, we had a economic crisis, social crisis. Then it appears as shale gas, and now we are the second reservoir in the world of shale gas. So now the industry is with a booming, with a flourishing, let's say, again. But the thing is that, we have to design public policies in order to distribute the rent of the resources in social goods. And we have to avoid the Dutch disease. And I think environment is other the issues that we have to be very aware, because with the lithium we we may put on risk water resources, and we have to consider this is a wetland. So I think we need to intervene with good public policies in order to preserve the sustainability in the social and environment levels. And also, I think we need to cooperate in designing the markets, and and have clear rules for the investors, and that's it. I mean, I think it's, as we said before, it's a huge opportunity for America Latina, and I think we have everything to do it in a good way.
Yeah, thanks. And let me go to Sjarah, back to Sjarah, because you mentioned the policy design, and what do you see in innovation in policy? Like, do you see some trends emerging, some useful things that people can replicate, countries can replicate?
Trends in or policy gaps. I think you also refer to the importance of governance, of regulatory frameworks. That's something that we've also been supporting. That's extremely important. I've already talked about the multi-stakeholder partnerships, and I think there are many organizations and intergovernmental cooperation frameworks that are already addressing these things, and I think we have to keep working on it. And we think it's very important to use like champions, businesses that can really that are doing already the right thing by looking really at social and environmental impact, and putting them forward as best examples, as something best practices that others can learn from. Yeah, that would be good.
Yeah, that would be very important. But Leonardo, let me go back to you. I mean, the fact is that out of 25 major companies that work in this space, 22 are privately owned. The multinational behemoths with a lot of influence, a lot of resources. How do we move that elephant? How can policymakers make a difference in that space?
Yeah, it's a good question, and actually I was on another panel last week at New York Climate Week, and the phrase a kind of mosaic of regulations across different countries, jurisdictions came up, and that mosaic, that difference, divergence in standards, regulations that govern the mining sector is often difficult and something that is tricky. So, I mean, I think there's two separate blocks of areas of potential progress. One is more in the voluntary standards space. So again, in our report, we looked at the current space of voluntary standards. There's a huge amount out there, ranging from organizations such as the Copper Mark, IRMA, the ICMM, the trade body, and many others. Again, there's lots out there. Adding more is maybe not the best thing, and rather trying to think about how increased coherence and clarity and more consistency that could be achieved across those different voluntary standards could be a really positive step from within the industry. But that is likely to be, impactful for the private companies that are willing to take those steps, but really you need to take the whole market with you, even those that aren't part of that. And so then that goes back to individual country and multilateral agreements on environmental, social, and other regulations that govern the mining sector. And there's a lot of potential for collaborating further. I think there's an increasing awareness of the potential for trade policy to go alongside these kinds of regulations. the agreement between Argentina and the EU is a good example of this, where consumer countries are willing to use a bit of the purchasing power to make sure that improved standards are introduced without causing undue kind of blockages to local economic development, in enabling these countries to also make the most of their resources. So there's always a balance to strike, there's always a bit of give and take, but taking those kinds of steps, it can also be positive in terms of lifting the whole market across different countries.
Indra, let me go back. Absolutely, but there is a limit to how far you can go with this, and again goes to the balance between the speeds and this pressure. And part of the speed and pressure thing comes from the words we use, the critical. So 35 lists, looked at detail, so many different parameters they use to define criticality. So can you reflect, this was absolutely not prepared in any shape or form, so Indra, you're on the spot. Can you reflect a little bit how we can, as a community, refine this narrative better to incorporate all these elements into this? Like, one is the criticality, the scarcity that we're going to feel. The other one is the potential for development, the strategic aspect of it for us. The third one is changing the industry. So how do we reconcile these agendas? They're equally important, and somehow then they're narrowly put in this criticality bucket. Actually, everybody can reflect on that, because I have no idea what we can do here.
A very open-ended question. I think I'll go back to where I started, in that, yes, there are critical materials which we really need, and there are many of them, and we need a lot of them. But those are also opportunities for cooperation. There are opportunities for gain for the countries that produce them, which are often developing countries. There are opportunities for companies to innovate and to make money, and for communities to get jobs and so on. So to look at the positive aspects of these, while recognizing the very, very big risks, which I could say a lot more about, but and the negative environmental and social impacts of these. But I think if we want to not get stuck in this negative critical materials discourse, we should also look at the positive sides of them. And part of the problem is that we have a lack of transparency in many of these markets. Many of these markets, if you look at the volume in weight or in terms of capital or in terms of money involved, many of these markets are really, really small. They have been really, really small, and now they're beginning to grow, and they're going to become much more big. And that involves a lot of growing pains. And I think one of the key problems is that we lack information, because when the markets were small, not that many people needed information, so there wasn't that much supply either. And now you see them popping up these, critical materials and lithium data consultancies and this type of thing. So in one of the technical papers that we're working on critical materials for IRENA, there will be some concrete proposals on this, on how to improve the governance and transparency of data, which I think is another way of facilitating maybe cooperation and at least better interaction.
Sjarah, just to go to you a little bit, because you're absolutely right, and transparency means a lot, and also, comparing it to totally unrelated, like a fashion industry, like a couple of decades ago, how much pressure there was around the conditions, the labor conditions, and the industry changed a lot. So do you think there is space for enlightened citizenry to put pressure on what sort of batteries they're getting? Do you think there's space for that? Can we do a better job in public campaigns or something to actually have public pressure around these issues? Or is it too narrow and technical?
I wish there was a space for that, but I think because of the fact that it's such a complex sector and so many actors involved, and the value chain is so long, so many actors involved. It's not easy to establish the link between your battery and where it came from. I'm not quite sure whether we will succeed in doing it. I wish we could, because I think it's worthwhile exploring it to mobilize consumers also in this discussion, because they can put pressure indeed, or by their purchasing behavior, they can also move things in the right direction, I think. Yeah.
If I can maybe just jump
Absolutely.
in on that. Right?
Push me out of a conversation.
No, so I think there is some potential for supply chain transparency, traceability, and in fact, even just in Europe, Systemic has been involved in developing a project called the Battery Passport, which is meant to develop a digital twin, right, of a battery that is able to trace the different materials, components throughout their supply chains, and gives you information on the battery, its whereabouts, and obviously informs decisions at end of life. What state of degradation does it have? Where is it located? That's often quite important. Could it be applied for reuse or recycled, and so on? And so there is a pipeline for this kind of developments in technology and in supply chain traceability. There's also lots of different ways that you can do it. I think it shouldn't be seen as a silver bullet. It's not going to solve all of our problems, but what it does is it enables more effective regulation. The European battery regulation that was just passed includes targets, say, for the carbon intensity of batteries. If you're able to accurately trace these different materials and batteries and different products throughout their life cycles, you can carry out these life cycle carbon intensity calculations more easily, feed that through to, say, a carbon price, which then translates through to a final price for consumers, and that flow of information hopefully nudges a few more individual decisions, which then pushes things towards lower carbon, more responsible supply chains for all these different clean energy technologies. So hopefully, hopefully there's steps in the right direction. Let's see how things unfold in the next few years.
Yeah, I want to go to Lucilla to speak about policy making as well, but Indra, you want to come in on this one, please.
Yeah, I'm thinking about, because you threw this unexpected question at me, I'll throw an unexpected answer back now that I have some time to think. And I think that also in terms of blunting this acute worries about criticality, is also to think a little bit about what we really need. And not all of this, but a good bit of this is about electric vehicles, or EVs. And somebody wrote recently, I don't remember who, I read it somewhere, that the future of cars is definitely EVs, but the future of mobility is not EVs. So it's also a question of how many of those EVs using those batteries with those critical materials do we really need? And there are different degrees and levels of the outcome of that, but that also depends a little bit on how available the materials are and how much destruction their extraction creates. And if it's too bad, then we have to go further in the direction of reducing our consumption a bit.
I think it's really interesting what you're saying, and for us, we're a global institution, and the diversity of priorities, and oftentimes these conversations really just drift into the OECD setting, and they're very different conversations in different parts of the world. And so to go back, you're a senator, so you sit in these political legislative discussions, and I'm sure you're not discussing the carbon footprint of whatever it is.
No, but we had big discussions like climate change law, and also there's a very good example in Argentina with renewables. I think it's a law for export because it was a result of a big consensus, and it was brought by a senator from Chubut, which is the other province producer of gas and oil, but also with excellent wind resources. And he brought this idea to create a regime to promote the renewable energy and to increase the power, the share of the matrix.
So what was the driver for that discussion?
Well, actually, I think climate change and warming, and I think to be in the real world, to take the things that really matters, and probably keep aside of the domestic issues and think globally. And the good thing is that this was a good discussion between public sector, private sector stakeholders, and then it keeps on going even though we change political parties in the government. So we could increase the matrix by renewable sources, and we have to achieve targets, mandatory targets, and we are doing really good. And I think when you have the purpose to do the things in the correct way, it's easy to do it. And we find the instruments and the incentives to bring investments and to improve, as I said, the matrix by renewables. So I think we have to discuss the big issues in the Congress. Now Argentina is in an electoral year, so it's kind of complicated. But we still have this agenda. So I think Congress is the best scenario to discuss public policy, because you can have the legitimacy then to develop the policy. So yeah.
Yeah, but no, excellent point, and I think we are right now in Europe in many countries.
Let me add just one thing about the what we were discussing before. I think we all agree that we need to go renewable, but there's a lack of debate of the impacts. And I think we have to discuss more the impacts, the social, environmental impacts. And I don't know, probably it would show still that it's the best way, and transition is what we need. But I think there's a lack of information of all the impacts in this industry.
You mean a positive impact or environmental footprint, or
in general,
everything?
Yeah, in general, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Especially with, for example, for I don't know, devices, batteries, recycling, many things that probably we always talk about. Power, energy sources, but for example, with the brines, we don't know the impact in the environment yet. So, so we need to discuss more probably before it's too late, and then to.
And I think that feeds into. I mean, you were mentioning the proactive policy making, really taking these issues head on. I don't know if you want to add something to this point.
Yeah. I think it's important to have more public discussions. You already asked about consumers being informed about those issues. I found it actually quite hard, or a quite negative message to read, that I think half of the cars that were sold recently were SUVs. And the use of electric vehicles has led to the increase of SUVs being bought. So it's like an effect that we didn't want to see. We wanted to see reduced emissions, etc. But now we see these larger cars popping up, and so. It is important, I think, to have like a public discussion about the effects that may have, the larger batteries that are needed for those cars, etc., and the environmental, social impacts, etc. But people, I think, a lot of our citizens aren't aware of it, so there may be scope to discuss, also in parliaments. Yeah.
Yeah, no, from our side, from IRENA's side, we in our scenario we always have a socioeconomic footprint because we were always looking at. It's not necessarily. I mean, it's very popular to say, renewables create more jobs, which is true. We're going to have a new report in a couple of weeks, I think. So the good numbers coming out. It's absolutely true. There are new industries, but it's not that straightforward, and it's important to understand the different elements in critical material report. When you look at water scarcity, it's very much coinciding with mining sites. So there is a really important element of holistic policy making and looking beyond the sectoral boundaries. Indra, looking beyond sectoral boundaries, and you said that mobility is not, what did you say? Mobility is not transport.
The future of cars is EVs, but EVs are not the future of mobility.
Yeah.
So, but everything we know, every government institution, every conversation that we have is somehow in these boxes and sort of neat sectors that we're accustomed to talk about them in these ways. So how do you think we can actually move away from, how can we innovate in our conversations and move away from this like really narrow conversation into something that is more encompassing and reflective of where we need to be, rather where we're coming from?
I think that's very difficult, but it has been done in some countries, and I think you need support in the electorate, which gives a government, which in a democratic country, which is sufficiently focused on this to take action, and then the action is usually to reorganize the central government administration. So it's changing structures of ministries, because in very many countries there are ministries staffed by often people who have been there for a very long time, and especially the senior people will have been there for a long time and have partly an old mindset or the things they know and they are able to contribute are old things. And I mean, I'm from Norway. We see this in Norway, where we have the Ministry of Oil and Energy, which handles all kinds of energy, but mostly focuses on oil, which has a privileged place. And we see it a lot in other countries also. And it's really a severe issue, overcoming these silos.
Energy Transition Commission, I mean, that was one of the reasons it was like, let's do things differently. So do you see, you've been around now for how long, a decade or so? Just a little bit less than that, because you're a little bit younger than IRENA, yeah. Because I remember when it was formed. So do you see any change in at that level of discussion in terms of how things are looked at?
Yeah, I think, the Energy Transitions Commission, it's a coalition of maybe 50, 55 different companies and NGOs spanning many different sectors. So the energy sector, utilities, power companies, but also heavy industry, some financial institutions, and then, like I mentioned, civil society and NGO organizations. And really, what we try and do is to speak to all of our different members across these different sectors, and some of them have very specific individual sector concerns, but often what we hear are echoes of challenges that everyone is facing. And that is what really lets us step back and speak with authority in terms of the challenges that industry and business are facing for the wider energy transition. And really that feeds through into all of our work. So just in the last year, 2 years, we've done a whole series of reports on what we call barriers to electrification. And these are cross-cutting barriers that everyone is looking at and is concerned about. And that covers planning and permitting for renewables. It covers finance and investments. It covers clean energy supply chains and critical minerals. And coming up early next year is going to be a deep dive on expanding power grids. All of these, even though they are specific to individual challenges, are challenges that cut across all these different sectors. So yeah, I would completely agree. When you break down these silos, you're able to have conversations that bring together lots of different people with lots of different views and understand what are the fundamental blockages that we need to unlock to really get the energy transition going in the next decade.
So let's go back to the to innovation, and I think we touched upon we touched upon the technology innovation, we touched upon the policy innovation, regulatory, but we didn't really speak that much about international cooperation. I think we spoke a little bit about it, but part of the issues that we are facing here for this particular conversation is that there is a lot of uncertainties around different things. There is a lot of tensions. There is issue of competition. There is an issue of inability to manage because it's largely private sector owned. So there is a level of really inability for countries to do much. So what would you think would be the most important steps to reconcile this growth? And maybe I'll go, whoever wants to go first, because this is also one of the questions that we did not discuss in advance. So I would like a volunteer on this one. How do you think we can reconcile this kind of short-term pressure that we have, so we put a climate change as a priority, because there is also discussions around policies around stockpiling, for instance. Is stockpiling good for global energy transition? I mean, what is the top priority? How do we innovate around what needs to happen? And secondly, how we align the cohort of entities and governments to actually move the agenda?
I mean, stockpiling of critical materials, or?
Not just stockpiling. Stockpiling is one of the traditional policies we turn to when there is scarcity, market scarcity. But in this instance, who can stockpile, who has the money, who has the capability, and who has the ability to maintain the stockpiles versus the climate imperative of advancing energy transition. It's a little bit of a competition between these two priorities. Look at this.
You volunteered.
I was just clarifying the question. But okay, I can have a shot at that.
I'm looking at you because a geopolitics expert.
I think in a context in which countries and companies depend vitally on certain materials, it does make sense to make sure that you have enough and maybe stockpile a bit. But I don't think it's a good grand solution because it actually artificially or additionally adds to demand in the period when demand is already ramping up, when worries are also rising. So at the same time, exactly at the worst time, stockpiling actually raises demand and could then exacerbate the scarcity. An alternative to stockpiling is legally mandated requirements for diversification. Saying, so your company wants to consume so much of this material. Well, by law, you have to get a certain percentage from a certain number of suppliers, which would partly reduce the dependency on single countries or companies providing supplies, but partly also lead to more investment in alternative locations for producing or processing materials. So it could have dual benefits, and maybe that's part of or one direction to go in.
And that's what we see. Actually, there's quite a lot of pressure to diversify and the movement in that direction.
But it doesn't have to be, because a lot of this now is about China and it's very dangerous and so on. But it doesn't have to be personal or country specific. It can just be in general. If a material is seen as critical, then you shouldn't get so much more than a certain percentage from one location.
You're absolutely correct. I mean, we saw it during COVID. It really doesn't matter where it is. If it's concentrated, it's a risk.
Yeah.
As simple as that. It could be anything.
If I can maybe follow up on that with I think that kind of policy is potentially very helpful in reducing diversification. The flip side is it might cost more. It might take longer to develop that diversified supply. And I think if we step back, that speaks to really the big challenge for policymakers. We set out at the start, there's three challenges. One is scaling up supply so that the energy transition can get going at the pace that we need. But then there's two other challenges. You want to de-risk and diversify, and you want to address these environmental and social impacts. Trying to address all three at once is difficult. and there are going to need to be trade-offs as countries develop, their industrial policy, their supply chain policies, whatever you want to call it. And being a bit more honest and open about the trade-offs between achieving these sometimes competing goals, I think is warranted. At the moment, there's maybe a little bit too much of a view that everything is, achievable and fine. But in reality, there's going to need to be some hard discussions, and more open discussions around these different trade-offs would be quite important.
So I was just reminded there's like I was chit-chatting with you, and there was like tons of questions popping up. And I love my panel today. It's really interesting group of people. So let's take the one that has the 14 likes. Even if the energy needed for the mining of the materials for electric vehicle batteries will be green in the future, and it is a big if, what about the CO2 emissions from the mining process? Most of the processing are very emission intensive. I think Leonardo is the expert.
Sorry, this is exactly the kind of question that frustrates me, but is exactly the kind of myth that we busted in our report. So it is very well documented. There's dozens of studies that look at the life cycle emissions associated with electric vehicles. Most of the emissions associated with an electric vehicle are from electricity consumed during use, and then actually from producing the battery. The mining of the materials, the upstream emissions, are very small. So, one, mining is the smallest of these big chunks. Two, those life cycle emissions for an electric vehicle, even now, even in a more coal-heavy grid, are still already lower than those of a petrol, diesel-fueled car. This is exactly the type of myth that we, as believers and supporters of the wider energy transition, need to be busting in every conversation that it comes up in.
So we need all of you to be ambassadors of myth busting.
And if you don't trust me, Transport and Environment has a beautiful interactive little tool. You can Google it, maybe not now, later, so you don't get distracted. And it does all these comparisons, does all the different scenarios, supply chains, and the rest. The electric vehicle always comes out better.
Anybody else wants to chime on this one? No? Okay, next one. What can be done on the global level to guarantee a safe, fair, don't move this when I'm reading, safe, fair, and ethical process for the workforce in the mining sector, especially in rapidly growing industry where national regulation might be too slow to catch up with such issues? I guess Lucilla or Sjarah.
Again, yeah.
There we go. What can be done at the global level to guarantee safe, fair, ethical process for the workforce in the mining sector? What could be, from international cooperation perspective, to help the local level?
We have to develop a collective capacity to manage the resources. Climate change is, we all lose or we all win. There's nobody is safe if we keep doing this thing. So I think we have to give incentives to achieve this cooperation we need. Actually, I don't know, I think we have to discuss this in the international forums. We have to subscribe agreements, but we have to create the real conditions just to be able to implement policies to see the results. That's why I insist so much in the social impacts, environmental impacts, but also the distribution of the benefits, the profits in social goods. The extractive activities, especially, gas and oil. I'm not an expert in Africa, but we have seen how countries have suffered extractive industries. And I think that's the picture we don't want to see again. And as I said, we don't have much time. I don't want to be, but we know that temperature is increasing, and I don't know if we are going to be able to achieve the goals we subscribe on Paris Agreement. And I think governments have to discuss more the structural issues and the world alliances to let's say, do what we have to do.
No, absolutely, and I mean, everybody's in a learning curve, so we need to. Do you want to chime in? Do you want to add something to this?
Yeah, I think there are very good initiatives and programs already that have been developed. When it comes to climate smart mining, we support the World Bank's climate smart mining program that helps resource-rich developing countries develop the mining sector while really looking at the environmental footprint and the emissions. So that's one initiative. But there's also, for example, the European Partnership for Responsible Minerals, and this partnership finances projects in conflict-affected areas to support responsible artisanal and small-scale mining. There's the industry body that you refer to, ICMM. So there are things that we can build upon instead of coming up with again something new. I think it's important to use those structures, and we have to look at. I think because you said you rightly pointed out that we do need to be involved in myth busting, but we also have to look really at localized effects, local effects on, and not only at the aggregate level, I would say. Yeah.
Thanks, Sarah. And so in our geopolitics report, it was interesting to see China's role also as an importer. What are the geopolitical implications of China's dominance, not only in processing of critical materials, but also an importer? This is a very big topic, and I don't want to occupy the space. So you want to? It's about China being both the importer and exporter, like dominance in processing, but also importer of raw materials. What are the implications of it?
China's very good at what it does, which is a lot of different things. And I think it's a good challenge for the rest of the world to try to also catch up and try to do things. At the same time, the rest of the world probably doesn't want to be too dependent on China or on any country. It should be a big multipolar system.
Right, and you can read the report. We actually talk about it quite a bit. The bottom line is that no country can do this alone. And understanding the landscape and understanding the dynamics, and as you rightly point out, diversifying and making sure that the supply chains are resilient without any dominance or too dependency, high dependency is absolutely critical. Again, it's not a daily issue. Sorry, I'm just going on a tangent, because it's not like fossil fuels, and oftentimes we talk about this as interchangeable risk. It's not. It's absolutely different. It's like the difference between having an apartment where you have to pay the rent all the time, or having a house where you have a certain control over how you're going to renovate it, and it's your asset and you can manage it. So that's also very important to remember. Can you explain why copper? I cannot. Leonardo, why is copper a critical material? Actually, I know.
That's a good question. Some people say that it is, some people don't. It goes back to the 35 different lists. So maybe the case against why it shouldn't be is it's a huge market, 25 million tons each year. It's highly commoditized. It's internationally traded. And there's a reasonable amount of diversified supply. That's the case against. The case for is every single clean energy technology needs copper. Copper is the material of electrification. And so as the energy transition unfolds, every bit of power grid, every electric vehicle, every solar farm, every wind farm needs copper. You're not going to be able to build this out without copper. And so if you think about copper as a strategic enabler of the energy transition, then you can view it as a critical strategic material. You could argue it either way. Some governments have gone one way, some governments have gone the other way. I'm sure Indra has some thoughts as well, but that's the case on either side.
My thoughts are very similar to yours. I mean, copper is a very big market and has been for a very long time. So in that sense, it has more space and more actors and so on. But there is going to be a need for a lot of copper in the future. I would tend to think of it as a critical material myself. It's not rare, but it's very critical, and there may be there may be some pressure on it.
Yes, but most of these materials are not rare. They're just that what sort of supply exists today and what are the
many of them have
reserves.
very small markets. The
Absolutely,
copper market is
very
a
small
huge
absolutely.
and an ancient market that has been there for a very, very long time.
I mean, lithium started to be publicly traded in 2021. This is how recent it is. Yeah, and just to underscore, Leonardo, what you said, I mean, the grid expansion and modernization, and this is going to be guzzling copper, and that's rarely spoken about because we concentrate more on solar, wind, and electric mobility. All right. How can we avoid another resource scarce situation in regions rich in critical materials? I think it's an excellent question. How to ensure local sustainable development impacts? We touched upon a little bit both with Lucille and Sjarah. And Lucille, did you want to elaborate on that? How to ensure local sustainable development impacts?
Yes, well, with frame legal. Yeah, well, I think, for example, in the case of Argentina, the resources belong to the provinces. It's different. It's kind of complex when you have to. Yeah, because it's, for example, in Chile and in Bolivia, they are centralized. In Argentina, it's federal. So each province, and the triangle of lithium is located in 3 different provinces. So it's even more complicated. So, but we have, I think we have to follow the environmental regulation and controls, and as I said, we have to learn from past experiences, especially gas and oil, and the use of water, and also the disposal of wastes. So with good controls and with good governments, and you know, it's not tricky. I mean, with good public policies.
It's absolutely clear that energy transition will not happen on its own. You have to have a government guidance and intervention. It's not, you cannot leave it to markets. And again, going back to holistic policy design, you cannot just look at the downstream part of development and deployment. You really need to look at industrial policy, labor policy, and the planetary policies.
And invest in technology, clean technology. I think Chile is developing a direct way to extract lithium. It's in some exploration stage. And I think we have to invest a lot in technologies, in clean technologies, and because we can't compromise water, for example.
Yeah. Did you want to come in?
Maybe just to say, I think there are already some very good examples out there of how to do this well. Maybe not to comment on national government strategies, but if you look at individual projects or individual companies that do this well, you know, best-in-class actors do proactive community engagement, understand both you know, the concerns that local communities have on the local environment, but are also able to bring tangible benefits to those communities, whether jobs, whether you know, local provision of education, technical skills, and employment, both during construction and operation. And so, you know, let's not pretend that we've got to reinvent the wheel. There's many good projects already out there. It's just a matter of making sure that more of the projects are better aligned with this kind of best-in-class type behavior that you can find.
I think also, but there are also very many cases historically and around the world of countries which have had value resources which have been extracted and which have not contributed, and where the country and local communities haven't become wealthier, or sometimes or often they've become poorer and more environmentally destructed, and also social issues. So what's the solution? There's no blanket solution. I think it's good to look at the more successful cases that exist, but I think also the other general thing we can say is what you're doing is to raise the question and to make everybody as aware as possible that this is difficult. You are sitting on something, some or other mineral resource, which may be very valuable, but historically that has been very challenging. And actually, with many of these resources, it's probably worse. Because with oil and gas, you knew that the price was going to go up and down a lot, but you knew that demand was, over decades, you're probably going to earn a lot of money. But if you're sitting on some mineral used for energy transition, the rise in demand may be extreme, or it may collapse. People have, look at cobalt. Demand outlook now is very different, much lower than it was previously, thanks to LFP, thanks to sodium ion, thanks to all kinds of developments. So at one moment we're worrying about Congo and cobalt and child labor and the environment and so on. And at the next moment, Congo may not be getting much of anything, neither the positive or the negative, because cobalt isn't such a big deal anymore. So, and I think to tell the Congos of the world those things up front, that, okay, let's try to use this opportunity, but be cautious about local impacts, and also be cautious about the risks and the uncertainty.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of fossil fuel story as well, because countries are now considering exploiting their resources. What sort of market will be there, if any, in 20 years' time? And this is a little bit linked to the question on how to strike a narrative balance between pushing for fast and deep decarbonization in the global north by exploiting resources of the global south. I think this is a critical question, and it's one also of distributional aspects, because the countries with resources can go fast, can do things much faster than in the global south. So it's going to be essential for, like Europe is leading by example in some ways, because the Critical Materials Act does include the policy that supports the value creation in developing countries. And these are the elements that every MOU should include. Anybody wants to chime in on speed versus impact?
I think this goes back to my point about trade-offs. There's trade-offs everywhere, and you need to strike the right kind of balance across all of them. Maybe the US Inflation Reduction Act. I can't believe we've nearly done 90 minutes without mentioning it, but it is a good example of the kind of the trade-offs or the different narratives that you can view this through. So if you take the more optimistic, hopeful narrative, the idea is that by accelerating deployment, manufacturing, and innovation, mainly within the US, that innovation over the mid to long term leads to cheaper clean energy technologies that are then able to be deployed more quickly in countries with less resources, less money to be able to deploy them as quickly on these early stages. The flip side, though, is you can view the IRA through a more protectionist lens, through a more, manufacturing value capture lens, where the US is going to accrue many of the benefits, tax revenues, jobs from all of this clean energy manufacturing, taking it away from more resource-rich countries. So, again, trade-offs everywhere. These need to be acknowledged and discussed a bit more openly, and it really does depend on how you view things.
Yeah, thank you. I was just told that we have to wrap up. So unfortunately, there's some very interesting questions still there. And maybe just for the last round, to give you like maybe 15, 30 seconds to leave one message on what do you think is the most important next step in the evolution of critical materials. And maybe I can start to give you a moment to think. Mm-hmm. In my opinion, the most important thing will be some of the myth-bustings and really bringing clarity and transparency to the issue so there is a greater understanding. And then we can dissect it and work around the problems that we can work collaboratively.
Yeah.
Lucilla.
What I think are critical materials, we have the ones who have the resources, the ones who have the technology, and the ones who have technology or capital or resources may have the three things. But the thing is that we have to put all together in order to guarantee the supply and give us a chance to move forward to transition. And that needs cooperation, and that needs honesty in the process of working in this agenda.
Absolutely.
Maybe two points. One is be optimistic. Availability, we have enough materials. We're going to be able to scale up supply in the long term, and the potential for innovation, both in terms of getting us around demand blockages, but also scaling up supply, is huge. It's really significant. So be optimistic. But then the second big point, as I keep hammering home, is acknowledge the trade-offs, talk about them openly, and make sure that we're able to have these kind of open conversations to address the really tough challenges around distribution, fair access to resources, making sure the benefits are accrued equally.
Yeah, I was intrigued also by your positive story about the scope for more cooperation instead of competition. I hope it will happen indeed, because we're living in a world where there is seems to be a lot of competition, and so I'm also touched by the positive vibe here. But let's make it indeed a just and inclusive transition, and make sure that worldwide also the inequality isn't increasing, but and the gap isn't widening, but it will be narrowing. So that's important. Mm-hmm.
I would say, firstly, try to limit the hype. And the hype is in all directions. I mean, about the criticality itself, about the availability, about the problems related to it, about the opportunities for income and so on. So limiting the hype a little bit. And I think, secondly, acknowledging the trade-offs here. There are a lot of dilemmas and a lot of trade-offs. And finally, I'll just maybe mention that I spent July in the nickel mines of Sulawesi in Indonesia, which is the world's main nickel mining area. You can drive 15 hours non-stop, and you're always seeing a nickel mine. So, and it's not tunnels; it's mountaintop removal. So their whole mountains are being removed. Mainly by Chinese companies using coal power. And there have been incidents where people working in the mines cooked alive in acid and so on. So and you can look out at the sea and you see 2 kilometers of brown water out from the coast. So you have environmental, social issues. But you also have a huge new source of income for Indonesia, which is very much wanted by the Indonesians. I saw there's a previous question here about the exploitation of the global south, but in most cases, the countries want these things themselves in the south. They want to develop these things, and they want to export and make money, and they are very angry when they are criticized or held back. So all the time you have these very difficult trade-offs, and you need to recognize them.
We need to talk about trade-offs. Thank you so very much. Wonderful conversation, and thank you all for staying with us for an hour and a half.
Thank you.